Raz, dwa, raz. Widzi nas. Szanowni Państwo, ten panel, jak już się Państwo zdążyli zorientować, będzie wyglądał troszeczkę inaczej, ponieważ mamy jedno przedłożenie tytułem wprowadzenia, może nie tyle wstępu, co wprowadzenia w tematykę. I mamy 3 dyskutantów. Jestem w tej doskonałej sytuacji, że nie muszę nikogo przedstawiać. Profesora George'a Weigela znają wszyscy. Najwybitniejszy, najbardziej znany biograf Jana Pawła II, amerykański pisarz, doktor honoris causa wielu uczelni wyższych. Paneliści, profesor Rocco Buttiglione, pan ambasador, son excellence, wszyscy znamy, i pan Andrea, imię takie same jak moje, więc pamiętam. Ciąg dalszy nie, ale jeszcze mam nadzieję do końca spotkania się nauczyć. Gagliarducci. Proszę Państwa, żeby trochę właśnie tę naszą atmosferę na samym początku zdetonować, ale już przechodzimy do naszego panelu i zapraszamy pana profesora George'a Weigla o przedłożenie. Chciałbym tylko przypomnieć, że tytuł tego panelu jest dosyć wymagający. Decyzyjność i sprawczość. Jan Paweł II wobec najtrudniejszych spraw Kościoła. To, co najtrudniejsze, ale i to, co najciekawsze, organizatorzy zostawili na koniec. Mam nadzieję, że ta formuła, którą wraz z organizatorami przygotowaliśmy, a więc także formuła dyskusyjna, mimo pory późnej i Państwa zmęczenia, będzie interesująca. Panie profesorze, słuchamy.
Thank you very much, Father, and good afternoon to everyone from Rome. I'm delighted to be able to be with you in this conference by Zoom. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but my obligations here in Rome this month made it impossible for me to come to Warsaw. My position at the close of this conference affords me the opportunity to provide a summary overview of John Paul II's pontificate, touching on many of the issues that you have already explored in depth today. To grasp the extraordinary achievement of Pope St. John Paul II during an epic pontificate spanning more than a quarter of a century, it's necessary to take a step back and recall the state of the Catholic Church in 1978. The Second Vatican Council remained undigested. 2 competing interpretations of the Council divided the Church. One interpretation, what Joseph Ratzinger would later call the hermeneutic of discontinuity, read the Council as an invitation to reinvent the Catholic Church, both doctrinally and pastorally. While the other interpretation, what Ratzinger called the hermeneutic of reform in continuity with tradition, struggled to find effective pastoral expression. This fundamental disagreement over the purposes of Vatican II had created a theological and disciplinary civil war that led to a breakdown of ecclesial communion. The most extreme example of which was the widespread dissent from the authoritative teaching and the defiance of ecclesiastical authority that followed the publication of Pope Paul VI, 1968, encyclical Humanae Vitae. The reception of the Council was made even more difficult by 2 cultural tsunamis. The sexual revolution that was made possible in part by the contraceptive pill, and the assault on all established authority that Western Europeans remember simply as 1968. In the wake of these vast cultural upheavals, it seemed that the Church had little or nothing to offer, little or nothing to say to the breakdown of the family, to the new feminism, to the assault on civil order and on democracy by the radicalized left, or to the rapid acceleration of secularization in historically Christian lands. Meanwhile, the Vatican's Ostpolitik had failed to relieve the intense political pressures on the Church behind the Iron Curtain. And in some instances, the Ostpolitik had made matters worse by demoralizing Catholic clergy and laity who wished to stand firm for religious freedom and other basic civil liberties. Concurrently, the Holy See itself was deeply penetrated by Warsaw Pact secret intelligence services, thus further complicating efforts at reaching what the architect of the Ostpolitik, Archbishop Agostino Casaroli, described as a modus non moriendi, a way of not dying for the Church in East Central Europe. The immediate post-Vatican II years had witnessed vast defections from the priesthood, the largest since the 16th century reformations, and the rapid secularization of the self-understanding and mode of life of many institutes of consecrated life. Those post-Vatican II years had also witnessed the theological and political radicalization of the Society of Jesus and other Catholic institutional elites, and the intensification of clerical sexual abuse, a phenomenon undocumented at the time, but made unmistakably clear by statistical studies conducted since 2002. All this had led to many forms of ecclesiastical demoralization. Many sectors of the world church suffered a lack of evangelical energy. Catholicism seemed to have little or no capacity to shape world affairs at a fragile moment in human history. Over 9,665 days, from October 16th, 1978, through April 2nd, 2005, John Paul II addressed, and in many cases reversed, this post-conciliar drift into ecclesiastical incoherence and Catholic irrelevance on the world stage. The reversal began on October 22nd, 1978, at the Mass publicly inaugurating the pontificate. The meaning of that day and its clarion call to faith and Christian witness, "Be not afraid, open the doors to Christ," the meaning of all of that was best captured by the French journalist André Frossard, who wrote, "This is not a pope from Poland, this is a pope from Galilee." Over the next 26 and a half years, this pope from Galilee, this 21st century apostle, who embraced the Great Commission of Matthew 28, "Go and make disciples of all nations," and urged 1.2 billion Catholics to become missionary disciples, ushered in the church of the third millennium, the church of what he called the new evangelization, in which the ecclesiastical institutions defended and preserved by the Counter-Reformation Church would be transformed into platforms for mission. In doing so, John Paul II completed a transition that had begun when Pope Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 until 1903, called the Church to engage the modern world in order to convert the modern world. The Magna Carta of this new evangelization was the 1990 encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the Mission of the Redeemer, in which John Paul II reminded us that the church does not have a mission, as if mission were one among many things the church does. No, the church is a mission. Every baptized person is a missionary, and everywhere is mission territory. This grand strategy of the new evangelization informed virtually every theological and pastoral initiative of the pontificate. John Paul II understood that the horrors of the 20th century, 2 world wars, 3 totalitarian systems, oceans of blood, mountains of corpses, the Holocaust, the Gulag camps, the Ukrainian Holodomor, and the greatest persecution of the church in history had shredded, had torn the moral and spiritual fabric of humanity. In lifting up the divine mercy, John Paul II offered the world the remedy for its pain. John Paul II understood that the sexual revolution had led not to greater human happiness, but to greater suffering, because the sexual revolution was a direct assault on the biblical understanding of the human person. His theology of the body was an effective and imaginative response to that challenge. And where the theology of the body has worked its way into the pastoral texture of Catholic life, it has transformed catechetics, marriage preparation, and the church's ministry to those who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. The establishment of the John Paul II Institute on Marriage and the Family at the Pontifical Lateran University and affiliated centers around the world was another initiative aimed at renovating the church's capacity to respond to the tremendous cultural transformations underway in the world and their effects on the most basic human relationships. Those institutes and the 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth, have led over the past 4 decades to a renaissance of Catholic moral theology that is animating the pastoral practice of the living parts of the church throughout the world. At the time of John Paul II's election in 1978, many churchmen thought that the young adults of late modernity were incapable of hearing the gospel call to conversion. John Paul II disagreed, and in the face of considerable skepticism, launched the World Youth Days that have become a major event in global Catholic life and the inspiration of many new and vibrant pastoral initiatives. John Paul II was a great reformer of the Catholic priesthood. The heroic model of priestly ministry he himself lived, which was inspired by the examples of Adam Stefan Sapieha and Maximilian Kolbe, in turn inspired 2 generations of priests throughout the world church. And as one American cardinal put it, made John Paul II the greatest vocations director in history. The 1992 apostolic exhortation, Pastores dabo vobis, I will give you shepherds, offered the world church a blueprint for seminary reform, and thus for the reform of the priesthood. And where its teaching has been taken seriously, seminaries are flourishing. The reforms in canonical procedure for dealing with sexually abusive priests that John Paul II established remain an essential part of the ongoing reform of the priesthood. Consecrated religious life offered the world an alternative to materialistic notions of human happiness and flourishing. The 1996 Apostolic Exhortation, Vita Consecrata, accelerated the authentic reform of institutes of consecrated life, and those that have followed its teaching continue to grow. And their example makes another important contribution to the new evangelization. In its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council taught that sanctity is not a matter for the church sanctuary alone. Of holiness, which includes the sanctification of the world. John Paul II's 1987 Apostolic Exhortation, Christi Fideles Laici, Christ lay faithful, continues to provide the blueprint for flourishing lay apostolates that work today to implement the Pope's call in Redemptoris Missio for lay Catholics to be the primary agents of evangelization in the worlds of politics, economics, and culture. And then there is the church in Africa. John Paul II paid close attention to the African church, nurtured it over 10 pastoral visits to that continent, and brought African churchmen into senior positions in the church's central administration. That Africa is now the greatest area of growth for the Catholic Church in the world is due in no small part to John Paul II. The Great Jubilee of 2000 should also be understood in terms of John Paul's renovation of the church. This is particularly true, I think, of John Paul's March 2000 pilgrimage to the Holy Land. In spending a week walking where Jesus and the first Christian disciples had walked, John Paul was reminding the church that Christianity is neither a fairy tale nor a pious myth. Rather, Christianity began when real men and women who lived in real places you can see and touch today were so transformed by their encounter with the one they first knew as the itinerant Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth, and who, after what they first imagined to be utter disaster, met anew as the risen Lord Jesus Christ, they were so transformed that they and their successors went out and converted over the next 2.5 centuries what historians now reckon to be between 1/3 and 1/2 of the Mediterranean world. And in reminding the church of this throughout the Great Jubilee, but above all in his walk where the Lord Jesus had walked, John Paul II was, in a sense, completing his authoritative interpretation of the Second Vatican Council. The council that John XXIII wanted to recenter the church's attention on Christ. In the 2 decades following the council, the church had become inwardly focused. The transformation of the church that John Paul II worked so hard to accomplish through the various initiatives noted here had at its heart that recentering on Christ and the proclamation that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the nations and the light of the nations. If October 22nd, 1978 marked the beginning of John Paul II's Christocentric renovation of the Catholic Church, his first pilgrimage to Poland from June 2nd to 10th, 1979, marked the return of the Catholic Church as a major actor in the drama of late modern history. My 1992 book, The Final Revolution, The Resistance Church and the Collapse of Communism, was the first in English, and perhaps in any other language, to argue that the Pope and the Church were pivotal figures in what we have come to know as the Revolution of 1989 and the collapse of European communism. The analysis in the book was met with some skepticism at the time of its publication. But within a decade and a half, America's premier historian of the Cold War, Professor John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University, would write that the beginning of the end of European communism came when John Paul II stepped off his plane at Warsaw Airport on June 2nd, 1979. That John Paul II was a pivotal figure in the drama of the Revolution of 1989, and perhaps the pivotal figure, is therefore now widely acknowledged. What is perhaps not so well understood, however, is how John Paul did what he did and what it meant for our understanding of the dynamics of history. During the 9 days of June 1979, the Pope helped ignite a revolution of conscience that made possible the nonviolent political revolution that followed. And he ignited that revolution of conscience by giving back to the people of Poland the truth about themselves, about their history, and above all, the truth about their culture. Own that culture, he said. Own the truth about yourselves as a people formed by a distinctive history in which your Christian faith played a significant role, and you will eventually find tools of cultural and spiritual resistance that the blunt material force of communism cannot match. By planting what Father Joseph Tischner would later call a forest of awakened consciences, John Paul II made possible a distinctive kind of social and political transformation that not only lifted the yoke of communist rule from Poland, although it surely did that, he also falsified both the Jacobin view of history, that history is the contest for power, understood as my capacity to impose my will on you, and the Marxist view of history, that history is the byproduct of impersonal economic forces. The Jacobin view of history, married to the Marxist view of history, had produced Leninist totalitarianism. And that evil plague was defeated by John Paul II's culture-driven view of history, namely that culture is the driver of history. Culture is the most dynamic force in history, over the long haul. Centesimus Annus, John Paul II's most developed social encyclical, issued in 1991, applied this culture-first view of history to the prospects for the free society in the post-Cold War world, teaching that the institutions and mechanisms of political and economic freedom would only function properly if they were supported by a vibrant public moral culture rooted in the truth about the human person and capable of fostering the virtue of solidarity, the virtue of fellow feeling and mutual responsibility among the members of society. Thus, the world impact of John Paul II should be understood as a heroic effort to develop a nobler humanism for the 21st century and third millennium. Karol Wojtyła had long been concerned about the condition of the great project of Western humanism, both as a result of his philosophical studies, which had shown him that the humanistic project was collapsing into various forms of secularized and self-referential solipsism, and his pastoral experience, which had shown him how that self-absorption was having damaging effects on individual lives, intimate human relationships, and society itself. Thus, in his submission to the Vatican Commission preparing the agenda for the Second Vatican Council, young Bishop Wojtyła had suggested that the Council address this crisis of humanism by focusing on Christ as he who reveals both the truth about God and the truth about our humanity. Similarly, in his major philosophical work, Person and Act, Wojtyła sought to break the humanistic project out of the prison of self-absorption by demonstrating that there are objective moral truths built into us, truths that reveal themselves through careful analysis, and that, lived out, make for individual human flourishing and social solidarity. This enduring concern for the Western humanistic project came to the papacy with Wojtyła and was on full display during the pontificate of John Paul II. Thus, in the 1998 encyclical on Faith and Reason, Fides et Ratio, John Paul demonstrated the mutual interdependence of these two attributes of the fully human person, teaching that faith kept reason open to broader horizons of experience and ultimately knowledge, while reason helped purify faith from superstition. Or, as he put it in the encyclical, faith and reason are the two wings on which the human spirit rises to a contemplation of the truth, and it is only in the truth that we are truly free. A revitalized and ennobled humanism also required a new dialogue between religion and science, another aspect of John Paul's determination to heal the breach between faith and reason. The Pope's re-examination of the Galileo affair was one example of his efforts to move religion and science beyond old antipathies. So was his ongoing personal dialogue with scientists with whom he gathered at the papal summer residence at Castel Gandolfo on numerous occasions. John Paul II's historic efforts to open a new level of dialogue between Christians and Jews also reflected this determination to build a nobler humanism. The world needed the witness of the two peoples of the Bible to the truths about the inalienable dignity of the human person revealed by the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus. That witness could only be a common witness if those two peoples, Christians and Jews, demonstrated the possibility of a genuine interreligious dialogue that transcended the pain of history. And in both these sets of initiatives, John Paul II sought to demonstrate the true meaning of tolerance, which does not involve ignoring differences, as if differences made no difference, but rather engaging differences within a bond of civility based on a mutual respect for the other as a fellow seeker of the truth. When he was writing Person and Act, Karol Wojtyła described that project to the French theologian Henri de Lubac as a response to, quote, the pulverization of the human person in the late modern world. His efforts to build up a global culture of life and his resistance to the encroachments of what he would call a culture of death that found expression in abortion and euthanasia were responses to this pulverization, just as was his challenge to communism. The 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, might therefore be understood as a different kind of social encyclical, complementing the analysis of the Free Society in Centesimus Annus by teaching that democracies that defined objective moral wrongs as rights risked an incoherence that would ultimately undermine democratic self-governance. Thus, the global pro-life movement, as he understood it, was both a social movement in defense of the weakest and most vulnerable of human creatures and an essential renovator of the moral and cultural foundations of democratic politics. Pro-life advocacy on behalf of the unborn, the severely handicapped, and the gravely ill was a matter of what we might call solidarity extended, and a further plank in the platform of a renewed and ennobled humanism. I was a formal witness in the beatification canonization cause of John Paul II, and I do not think that I violate the pontifical secret I swore to respect by noting that, like other witnesses, I was asked to assess John Paul II's life through the prism of the virtues, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, courage, and moderation. This posed what struck me as an interesting question. What does it mean to live the virtue of prudence heroically? For the heroic practice of the virtues is one measure of sanctity as the Church understands it. What does it mean to live the virtue of prudence heroically as a pope? That's an interesting question. As I thought about this, it seemed to me that the heroic practice of prudence, the papal heroic practice of prudence, cannot mean that a pope's every decision was correct. That's impossible. Popes make mistakes, even saintly popes. Therefore, I came to the view that for a pope to practice the virtue of prudence heroically means that he made his decisions after suitable reflection, seeking the counsel of others, but above all, he made his decisions without fear or favor. Decisions were made without fear of what they might mean by way of criticism or worse. Decisions were made on the merits of the case, not to please someone or seek favor for an ulterior motive. That, as I understand it, was how John Paul II confronted the hardest challenges facing the church of his day, and how he made his decisions about meeting those challenges. It has often been said that John Paul II was not a skillful, hands-on manager or an adept administrator. I think that is not quite right. It is true that he was not a micromanager, as his predecessor Paul VI had been. But if the mark of a good administrator is to set large goals and patiently work to achieve them, then the record of accomplishment I have just outlined, and which this conference has examined in detail, suggests that John Paul II was in fact a very good administrator of the church's affairs. He did not force decisions before the time was ripe. He was patient over the long haul while keeping his focus on the long-term goal. He trusted his own judgment, but he was open to the input of others. He was self-aware enough to know that there were men and women who knew more about some matters than he did, and he drew on their counsel. He did not think of the papacy on the model of a czarist autocracy. He knew that he was the servant of Catholic tradition, not its master. As for those who read his pontificate through the lens of what we now know about such men as Martial Maciel and Theodore McCarrick, let this be said. Maciel and McCarrick were psychopaths. Psychopaths deceive people, even saints. To suggest that John Paul II knew of the grave sins and crimes of these men and ignored them is nothing short of calumny. It is also inconceivable to anyone who knew Karol Wojtyła that he would ever countenance the sexual abuse of anyone, and especially young people. When John Paul II said to the American bishops during the American abuse crisis of 2002, quote, "There is no place in the priesthood and in religious life for those who would harm the young," he was expressing a conviction he had lived throughout his life as both Archbishop of Krakow and Bishop of Rome. There is no such creature as a perfect pope. Perfection is not the standard by which we measure papal greatness. Fidelity to Christ and tireless witness to Christ's truth is the standard. And because of that standard, many of us speak with good reason about Pope St. John Paul the Great. Thank you.
Very good, George.
Bardzo dziękuję za to niezwykle panoramiczne, ciekawe, szerokie przedstawienie pontyfikatu Jana Pawła II, co było doskonałym podsumowaniem dzisiejszej konferencji, dzisiejszej sesji. Wiele wątków się pojawiło. Brzmiało to trochę tak, jakby pan George Weigel nas podsłuchiwał przez dzisiejszą konferencję. Inne wątki pojawiły się nowe. Ja obserwowałem tutaj moich, pozwolę sobie powiedzieć, kolegów i ich reakcje. Profesor Rocco Buttiglione był cały czas uśmiechnięty. Pan ambasador reagował na niektóre smaczne stwierdzenia, a pan Gagliarducci zachowywał dystans, jak to powinien robić dziennikarz. Ale teraz, to oczywiście było tytułem, proszę państwa, obudzenia, abyśmy mogli dalej dyskutować. Szanowni państwo, podczas dzisiejszej konferencji bardzo dużo usłyszeliśmy o sprawczości Jana Pawła II. Mówił o tym także przed chwilą profesor George Weigel, ukazując nam naprawdę szeroką perspektywę działań papieża, problemów, przed którymi stał i które starał się rozwiązać, rozwiązywał, problemy, które przekraczały przestrzeń i granice Kościoła. Także były to problemy natury społecznej, politycznej, nie tylko wobec Polski, ale także wobec Europy i świata, a także próbował odwrócić, zatrzymać pewne problemy czy prądy, tendencje kulturowe. Pozostaje, proszę państwa, drugie pytanie, trochę trudniejsze, bo to jest pytanie o jego decyzyjność. Pytanie to pojawia się ostatnio przede wszystkim w kontekście podnoszonej krytyki wobec postaci Jana Pawła II w odniesieniu do kwestii ochrony małoletnich i nadużyć osób duchownych wobec nich. O tym mówił pan profesor George Weigel w ostatnich akapitach swojego przedłożenia. Chciałbym zapytać, nawiązując do tego wystąpienia, zwłaszcza do tych ostatnich akapitów, to jest pytanie oczywiście najpierw do autora tego przedłożenia, ale jednocześnie do wszystkich dyskutantów. Chciałbym zapytać o to, jaki typ władzy sprawował Jan Paweł II. Zauważyłem, że panowie dosyć energicznie reagowali właśnie przy tym pasusie dotyczącym sposobu realizacji tej władzy. Ciekaw jestem, czy panowie się zgadzają z tą koncepcją George'a Weigela. Jeszcze w książce Koniec i początek, The End and the Beginning, opisuje pan to łacińskim określeniem wziętym z prawa kanonicznego munus regendi. To pięknie brzmi w języku teologicznym, w języku kościelnym, w języku kanonicznym. W świadku nadziei odrzuca pan zarzuty wobec papieża, jakoby był władcą autorytarnym. Dzisiaj w tym przedłożeniu też się pojawił ten wątek. Dzisiaj dopowiedział pan, że inaczej niż Paweł VI, to bardzo interesujące porównanie do Pawła VI, Jan Paweł II nie był micromanager, nie był mikromenadżerem. Przypomnijmy, że tak określamy zarządzanie bazujące na kontroli każdego aspektu sytuacji oparte na bezpośredniej obserwacji i kontroli pracy. Nie wiedziałem, że są tacy szefowie. I teraz moje pytanie jest takie, w jaki sposób papież łączył ten munus regendi, czyli takie teologiczne myślenie o władzy, z administracją, z zarządzaniem firmą? Czyli jaką formę władzy sprawował i czy to był dobry, skuteczny wybór, jeżeli chodzi o to sprawowanie władzy w Kościele? Może najpierw pan profesor Weigel, jeśli chciałby się odnieść jeszcze do tego wątku.
Well, popes wield power in many ways. Perhaps the most effective over time is in the appointment of bishops. I can speak, I think, with some authority about the church in the United States. Over 26 and a half years, excuse me, John Paul II essentially renovated the church in the United States to the point where it is, I would say, the most vibrant local expression of Catholicism in the Western world. He did that by appointing bishops who were dynamically orthodox, not simply repeating old formulas, but fulfilling the challenge that John the 23rd laid before the Second Vatican Council, to find ways to express the sacred deposit of faith in ways that modern men and women could hear and be transformed by. Secondly, I would say he exercised that munus regendi by his magisterium. You can't really separate into completely hermetically sealed categories the munus regendi and the munus docendi, the teaching office of the Pope. John Paul II led with ideas because he understood that ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. He knew this in his bones from his experience of the Second World War and his experience of Poland under communism. At the same time, he understood the transformative power of good ideas, and especially the transformative power of the idea that in Christ we meet the truth about the human person and about our noble destiny. So by constantly coming back to that Christocentric theme, he was both teaching and leading, and that inspired, as I said a moment ago, not only bishops, but priests and laity. There is not a single lay initiative in the United States today that I'm aware of that has real effect that was not inspired by John Paul II. That's an extraordinary accomplishment. When I say he was not a micromanager, I mean, and this would be my final point, that he tried to find men who shared his Christocentric vision of Vatican II, his commitment to the new evangelization as the church's grand strategy in the 21st century. He put them in significant positions in the Roman Curia, and then he let them get on with their work. He didn't micromanage them. And of course, the greatest example of this was his extraordinary relationship with Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would become his successor. I think one has to look very, very far back in the history of the papacy to find a partnership between two men of brilliance like Wojtyła and Ratzinger that worked so well together. That's good management. That's good exercise of munus regendi and munus docendi, ultimately in service to the munus sanctificandi, the sanctification of the world.
A jak panowie to widzą? Bo to jest pytanie takie, czy bycie papieżem nie jest najtrudniejszą funkcją na świecie? Oczywiście w tym aspekcie administracyjnym, bo trzeba łączyć ze sobą władzę kościelną, autorytet duchowy i jeszcze przewodnictwo polityczne. Czy jest to bardziej pułapka dla każdego papieża, dla Jana Pawła II także, z której się uchronił, czy to jest przede wszystkim wyzwanie, które no właśnie nie tyle jest pułapką, co wyzwaniem w sensie pozytywnym? Jak panowie to widzą?
Yes, I totally agree. It must be quite a nightmare to become Pope, especially for you if you have been a bishop or then a cardinal, and you know your diocese, you know your country, but suddenly you get a totally new diocese, which has 1.3 billion people, which is the entire world. You have to get to know the complicated world of the Vatican, and you come into a place where you don't know the rules, and the entire world looks at you and expects something from you. So I think John Paul II did, and why he was able to speak with so much authority, was that he brought with himself a very clear vision of Christ, of man, of mission. He brought all of that, and it allowed him from the beginning to clearly lead as a pope. I remember when he was elected, when I heard the voice for the first times, and then when he accompanied us in our everyday life as Catholics with his rosary in the hand, kneeling in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and always that voice, you felt this is someone who knows what he's doing. He is leading by conviction, by a strong male leadership. He was a man. You could feel he was a man who had a clear vision, and he felt that he was put there by God. You could tell that, but it was always with laughter, as I said before in my talk. But we lay people, we felt this authority that came from this man, even if he had to take over a very complicated job. And he did it in a very creative way. I imagine escaping from time to time the Vatican security, doing things in an unexpected way, beginning to travel all over the world. So he put his stamp on it from the beginning, and he touched many, many hearts. Just in my family, I know my brother is a priest because of John Paul II. I know that we began to go on pilgrimages and pray rosary every day because we knew that our Pope was praying the rosary every day. So that was how I see the beginning of his pontificate.
Ale jaka jest relacja pomiędzy byciem charyzmatycznym przywódcą a sprawnym zarządcą instytucji?
You have to ask someone else.
Jak jest trudne pytanie, to prosimy kolegów. Proszę bardzo, profesor Buttiglione.
Well, it is not easy. He did not study to become a pope. The last man who studied to become a pope was Paul VI. But Karol Wojtyła had not studied to become pope. And there was a lot of things he did not know in the Curia. The Curia is a complicated issue to manage. How did he manage? He was not concentrated on the Curia. I think in the beginning he was worried about the Curia. He made even an attempt to reform the Curia with Cardinal Gagnon. But later I remember something changed. He let free reins to his personal intuition. He was a missionary disciple. What is our task? Our task is to evangelize. And so he created somehow what Pope Francis would call Iglesia in salida, a church reaching out. Mm-hmm. He concentrated not on the church, but on the world, on the nations, on the people, on the issues. And then he demanded the Curia to mobilize itself in order to achieve the result of evangelizing the world around. He had the cooperation in knowing, by the way, he knew his limits. He knew that he did not know the Curia. And then he had some friends. He had the capacity of having friends. And he asked them to manage the Curia. The micromanagement, it was not absent. It was Cardinal Re. Some others also, but among the friends in the Curia, I will make the name of Cardinal Re. Cardinal Re guaranteed at least that the Curia did not make too much damage. And perhaps even that the Curia might do something good, but that is a little bit too much, perhaps. And he concentrated and asked, he created a network of friends in order to evangelize the world. And he led making always an appeal to the conscience of the other, which to a fellow countryman of Machiavelli like me appears to be a defect, because well, he was always ready to believe to those who pretended that they had not made mistakes. He was always ready to give a second occasion to people. He had confidence in the conscience of the people. He made always an appeal to the conscience of the people. Sometimes it worked. To my personal surprise, sometimes it worked. I remember that one day we were talking and I told him, Your Holiness, communists have no conscience. We were talking about, not the Curia, about Poland. He laughed and said, well, in the end, they are men. And in the end, they had a conscience. It took a lot of time to arrive to this conscience. It took 8 years of the dark night of Jaruzelski. But in the end, they had a conscience. And so it was to the Curia. Although perhaps to reach the conscience of the Curia was more difficult than to reach the conscience of the communists. But nevertheless, he did. And in making evaluations, you must not forget one point. In the last years, he was, but you know, he suffered a lot. Take the case of Martial Maciel. I tell you a personal story. I went to Castel Gandolfo. I had spoken with some Mexican friends, and I had very serious accusations against Martial Maciel. And I went to Castel Gandolfo. I wanted to tell the Holy Father. I arrived, and I had not the courage of doing that, because I thought, he's about to die. Why should I bitter the last days of his life? He lived this agony for 5 years, with moments that were better, and of course, in these last years, his capacity of working was reduced because of his illness. And this is the reason why perhaps some issues were not tackled immediately. There were two elements. On the one hand, he was ill. On the other hand, he was well. He did not like to speak badly about anybody or to listen to people complaining against anybody. He had a tremendous respect for each individual human person. That was, well, at the same time positive and negative. Negative from the point of view of Machiavelli, but perhaps positive in front of God.
Profesor Rocco Buttiglione dotknął tematu, który właśnie...
Professor Rocco Buttiglione touched upon the topic I wanted to continue, because there is no power, there is no authority without knowledge. It's a relevant question, because at present, technology allows the Pope to know everything all at once. Pope Francis just glances at his mobile and he knows it all. He knows what's being written about the Synod and about anything, basically. The Pope John Paul II lived in the era of a technological breakthrough. He started in the era of television, and his pontificate ended in the era of internet. But technology is not the only context to my question. My question is, what is it that John Paul II knew, and what is it that the popes know in general? What's the information flow that's so necessary to rule, to manage? Professor Buttiglione mentioned certain human elements, which, as he said himself, are very ambiguous. From the Machiavelli point of view, they might be negative, but from the perspective of God, maybe not so at all. We have a journalist, a diplomat, a politician, and a researcher here, people dealing with information day in, day out. What would you say, gentlemen? What is it that the Pope should know, and what is it that the Pope did know?
Obiecałem, że łatwo nie będzie.
Well, I told you it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy, but it's even easy at the same time. I think, for my experience, which is not fed with so many personal experiences with John Paul II for age reasons. I'm younger than you all, so I never met actually John Paul II. But in general, by a journalist, I can say that the popes can know everything and not know everything at the same time. And I will explain it. Popes have a bunch of information. Even John Paul II had a bunch of information. He liked to have people for lunch every day. So he exchanged information, he listened to people and whatever. At the same time, he just listens what people want him to listen. Popes don't have the time to go through all the dossiers. It's impossible. I mean, it's impossible. They need to trust. We get back to the point of Professor Weigel's presentation. You know, you need to find a good man and trust about them. But even with trust, there is something you miss. You know everything, and you don't know everything at the same time. So the issue is not about how much information you have. The issue is about how you deal with it. And in those cases, you can deal it well, you can deal it badly. It depends mostly on discernment, mostly on luck sometimes, because you need to be lucky to understand what's the right decision. Sometimes what I see in the Vatican, what I've been seeing, observing the Vatican for 15 years, is that in many cases, things are more trivial than what we can think. You know, there are no plots sometimes. Because to have a plot, you need very smart people. Sometimes you don't have so many smart people. You just have casual issues. I mean, so that's pretty much the answer. It's very cynical, I know, but that's what I see.
Just one little observation. You say Pope Francis has a mobile and he can see what people write about the synod. That's not true, because the mobile, you can see it sometimes, is just for typing and for text messages. He doesn't go online.
I don't know. Ja nie wiem. Profesor Rocco Buttiglione się zgłaszał, tak.
Now,
Professor Buttiglione wanted to speak.
The first one, he had friends. John Paul II had friends. One of these friends was Joaquin Navarro Valls. Joaquin Navarro Valls was not just a press chef. He was much more. He was a friend. He knew. He participated in the discussion of the inner circle of the friends of Wojtyła. He knew the way in which Wojtyła thought. And he could screen information and bring to him relevant information. And he could react immediately, even without consulting the Holy Father, because he knew the way in which he would have thought. Joaquin Navarro is an important part of the team that he had constructed for himself for the mission of evangelizing the world. The second observation regards United States. George, I hope you will not take it as an offense, but I have been having contact with people of the Department of State of the United States and with the Curia around John Paul II. The State Department knew everything. They know everything. Do you want to know how many eggs are produced in the Transcarpathian Ruthenia? They know. And they don't understand anything. Because they have an economicistic bias. They do not see man in culture. John Paul II did not know anything, but he understood everything. Why? Because he would call a Monsignore coming from Transcarpathic Ruthenia and ask him, and he would explain to him from the inside the way in which the people had lived those problems and what were the possible outcomes of things. And he would also make a control. He would call one from Transcarpathic and another one from Ciscarpatic Ruthenia to see the same issue from another point of view. And the third thing is that he liked to understand, and he loved people. Once, a common friend of George and of mine, Michael Nowak, he was not satisfied with Sollicitudo Rei Socialis. And I met him in Milan. He came, he gave a lecture, and I had a clash with him. I defended the Sollicitudo Rei Socialis. He attacked the Sollicitudo Rei Socialis. And then I talked to John Paul II, and I said, well, he said that you do not understand the United States. And I expected a rush of indignation. And he said, well, who knows? Perhaps he's right. Why don't you call him? And why don't you invite him to have dinner with me so that we can talk, I can listen. And when he died, Michael Novak wrote an article saying, there is no pope before in the history of the church ever understood the United States, the spirit of the United States, as profoundly as this pope, because he had listened. And of course, he also spoke and allowed Americans to understand better what he meant. So these are three important points on the management of information in John Paul II.
Dzięki profesor. Dzięki.
Yeah,
Tak jest, oczywiście, bo dzięki profesorowi Buttiglione, moment, przenieśliśmy się do Mukaczewa i Użhorodu, ale my musimy wrócić teraz do Rzymu, ponieważ profesor Weigel ma teraz bardzo ważne zadanie. Musi nie tylko obronić papieża, ale jeszcze amerykański sekretariat stanu. Co pan na to?
Well, you're looking at the wrong person if you want me to defend. One of my favorite stories is that the Archbishop of Washington in 1962, a man named Patrick J. O'Boyle, wanted the Second Vatican Council to discuss, in light of the doctrines of creation and redemption, the possibility of intelligent life on other planets. And when I first read this, I laughed out loud, and the archivist said, "What's so funny?" And I said, well, I've lived in Washington for, at that point, 20 years. And if I were the Archbishop of Washington, the first thing I would want to know about is the possibility of intelligent life in my own archdiocese before I started worrying about other planets. Three points on popes and information. What is crucial, it seems to me, are the filters. Can the Pope process information that contradicts or challenges what he already thinks? Because if you can't do that, you're going to be in big trouble. That leads to a second question of filter. Are you aware of your own prejudices? Do you know how what's built into your personality, your life experience, is acting as a filter on information? And are you aware enough of that to deal with it? And then thirdly, do you seek out people who will challenge you? Or do you simply like to listen to people who tell you what they think you're going to want to hear? Those are qualities essential in any leader. They're especially essential in a pope because the Pope is surrounded by a court, and courts tend to be sycophantic. Courts tend to shy away from telling the monarch things that he might not like to hear. And yet, if you don't welcome that, you're going to have serious administrative problems, but it's also a spiritual problem. We all need people who will tell us when we are making a mess of things. Wives are exceptionally good at this, I will say, after 48 years of marriage. Popes don't have wives, but they need people who will tell them no, that's not quite the way it is. And you could do that with John Paul II. He was a very self-confident man, but he was self-confident enough to be able to say, when you would say, no, I don't think that's quite right, to say, okay, tell me why. Now, he might not agree with you at the end of the discussion, but he was open to that kind of input. And that is very important.
Bardzo dziękuję, zwłaszcza za tę tezę dotyczącą żon papieży, która wprowadziła też pewien element ożywienia do naszej rozmowy, ale chciałbym na końcu postawić jeszcze jedno pytanie poważne jednak. Chantal del Sol, wszyscy znamy Chantal del Sol, w swojej książce pod tytułem La fin de la chrétienté, czyli koniec świata chrześcijańskiego, stawia tezę, która jest ostatnio dosyć powszechnie znana, że w sprawie nadużyć stosuje się współcześnie kryteria do oceny zjawisk z przeszłości, które podlegały wówczas innym kryteriom wynikającym z innej wiedzy, świadomości społecznej itd. Del Sol pisze wprost. Winni podlegają prawu działającemu wstecz. Karze się ich za to, co wówczas traktowano pobłażliwie, stało się z czasem zbrodnią. Del Sol mówi wyłącznie o tym jednym zjawisku, ale czy podobny mechanizm, jak to mówimy w nauce prezentyzmu, nie pojawia się także w odniesieniu do innych zagadnień? Czy w ocenie pontyfikatu Jana Pawła II ten historyczny komponent jest wystarczająco brany pod uwagę? Czy niezbyt często patrzymy na niego właśnie ze współczesnej perspektywy, współczesnymi kryteriami? Ale z drugiej strony mam jeszcze jedno pytanie. Czy skrócenie czasu na rozpoczęcie procesu w jakimś sensie nie zaszkodziło temu dystansowi? Czy paradoksalnie, gdyby ten proces nie zaczął się później, ta świętość nie byłaby prawdziwsza niż ta, którą sobie trochę chyba, jakby to powiedzieć, wyolbrzymiliśmy przez to Santo Subito? Co panowie na to? Co na to profesor Weigel?
Well, I'll begin. If John Paul II is not a saint, then no one is. It was clear to the people of the church that this was a man who had lived a life of heroic virtue. Benedict XVI handled that popular demand for an immediate canonization, if you will, exactly the right way, by allowing the process to begin without waiting the normal 5 years. Process was a very rigorous one. The documentation was extensive. I hope Monsignor Oder, Bishop Oder now, eventually writes about his experience as the postulator, because I think it's a very edifying experience. And it was a very difficult experience because he had to look into all sorts of things that required examination. So that's my view on that. There is something. Well, let me preface what I'm about to say by saying I wrote the first book in the United States analyzing the abuse crisis in 2002, its sources, its causes, the remedies for it. For some reason, the book is still selling hundreds of copies a year. It's been published in Polish. It's called The Courage to be Catholic. Those who are interested in reading it in Polish can read it in Polish. So I take a backseat to no one in condemning the sins and crimes of clerical sexual abuse, which I believe the church is going to be dealing with for many years to come, but which I believe we have dealt with in ways that other institutions in society have not begun to deal with. That being said, weaponizing the abuse crisis to forward other agendas, whether that is the attack on celibacy within the church or political attacks on Catholic moral positions involving the life issues, weaponizing the abuse crisis for either ecclesiastical or political purposes is despicable behavior. It is an abuse of the abused, and it's an abuse of the truth, and it should stop. And that is especially addressed to journalists who may be listening to this.
No,
No, I totally
dziennikarze zostali wywołani do mikrofonu.
No, I totally agree with Professor Weigel. I mean, I wrote that many times that it's despicable weaponizing the abuse crisis. There is an abuse crisis. I totally agree that the church has dealt with the situations like no other institution ever. And this is something that also Pope Francis had to recognize at one point in 2019 when there was this huge abuse summit. And everybody was thinking that he was going to make some strong statement, and last statement, he explained that abuse crisis is in society, not only in the church, so you cannot criminalize the church. And that's one thing. I also think that we're weaponizing John Paul II pontificate very much because it's part of the history that we want to forget. I mean, at one point, it's easy to forget history. And in this world that is very, very quick, it's kind of easy to get rid of things before. John Paul II is the penultimate thing. Then we'll have Benedict XVI. We'll have, it's an attack against the church that goes also against John Paul II. With the addendum, I will say that John Paul II has been in position for 27 years, which means that it's kind of harder to attack him because there are a lot of evidences, a lot of issues, a lot of things that have not explored yet but are there. And that's why the attacks are harsher. That's why there is a way that they want to dismantle a pontificate that actually was great. I mean, John Paul II pontificate is the proof, in my view, that ideas are greater than realities. And not what Pope Francis says, that realities are greater than ideas. Because with a huge idea, Christocentric idea, Christ, you can do whatever you want. He had an idea, he had friends that got along with the idea, he worked for the idea, and then he made something. That's something very hard to dismantle. So if you use abuse crisis, if you use these issues, you can try to forge a public opinion, but the public opinion doesn't always say the truth. And the problem is that now we are more aware, we're more, let's say, not aware. We worry more than the published opinion than the public opinion. And that's a real issue, I think.
I worked for 5 years for a bishop who my Bishop Klaus Küng, he was the one leading the foundation that looked after and helped victims of sexual abuse. So I looked just a bit into this. I didn't write a book like George Weigel. And my impression is, and you are right in this point, that it is very unfair to look at things that may have happened 40 years ago with the knowledge, the awareness, and the total knowledge that we have today. I spoke with people who told me that the psychotherapeutic medical knowledge about what exactly sexual abuse is arrived in society from the 80s towards the 90s, in the church even later. Sometimes things probably have been dealt with. This is a sin, and if you confess and you decide not to do it anymore, it will get better, therefore leading to policies of sending someone somewhere else, because the knowledge about the whole medical background had not arrived in the church at that point. Condemning people backwards 40 years with the knowledge we have today is, as you said, unfair, and we shouldn't judge on things that happened 40 years ago with an eye of 2023. So you're right on that point, I think.
Dziękuję. Professor?
Well, first of all, let us make a little bit of history. Pedophilia has always been present in the Catholic Church, but it has grown strongly, I would say enormously, in the 68, that is immediately at the time of the sexual revolution. And it has declined in the pontificate of John Paul II. We know that there are less cases, 1/2, more or less. And I think this is, to a large extent, an effect of a witness given to an heroic ideal of priesthood given by John Paul II. So, second, it is very correct what the Mr. Ambassador, or shall I say the Archduke? I don't know. Anyway, what Mr. Ambassador says, let us look to what was happening then, in those years, on pedophilia. Do you remember a manifesto in favor of the decriminalization of pedophilia in France? I remember. And you know who signed this manifesto? Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Foucault. Did anybody organize a criticism of Jean-Paul Sartre or of Michel Foucault because of their stand on pedophilia? They wanted to decriminalize pedophilia. And do you know that Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a star, no, a declining star, then it was a rising star, of the European left, wrote a book in which he presents himself as a pedophile? And in Germany, a section of the Social Democratic Party and of the Green Party, they organized a study group to prepare a bill of law decriminalizing pedophilia, and organized kindergarten, organized according to the idea that we must set free the sexuality of the young. Do you remember? I do remember. You are young people, but I do remember. That was the general climate. And the position of the church on pedophilia was that the ambassador has described. It is a sin, like all other sins, and I send you 1 year. And the people thought, well, it is a sin, and one can be healed. Now we know that it is very difficult that one is healed. The probability of falling back again is extremely high, and it should never be put in a position in which he has contact with young people. Now we do. And then everybody thought, well, children do not realize what happens, do not understand. It is not a great damage. Now we know that you suffer until the end of your days, but then we did not. So there is a tremendous, and by the way, to conclude, I could go on very long, because,
yes, I know
it
that.
is a long story. Just one. Do you know of the great scandal of the Boy Scouts of America on pedophilia now, and that the percent of pedophiles among Boy Scout leaders is much higher than among priests? One last point. Nevertheless, what has happened is terrible, no doubt. And the most terrible thing are the bishops. How can a bishop who has 20 priests who are pedophiles in his diocese, and it is a diocese with 120 priests, not 2,000, how can he say, I did not know, I never realized? Which kind of father is this bishop to his priest? How much does he talk to his priest? So I do not want, I shall not expand on this because I see that you are nervous. But,
No.
The watch is nervous.
It's time.
The watch is nervous.
Yes,
anyway,
it's my watch.
I shall not expand on this. So absolutely, it has to be condemned even more than what has been done up to this point. No, I must say one word to defend Pope Francis. Reality has always more determination than the ideas. You always find something that your theory could never foresee. And this is also a principle of the philosophy of Wojtyła. You must listen to reality and never pretend that you have succeeded in taking reality prisoner in your theories.
Dziękuję. Dziękuję bardzo. Nie jestem nerwowy z tego powodu, tylko z powodu organizatorów, którzy kazali mi pilnować czasu, a wiem, że też są na sali osoby, które mają niepohamowaną potrzebę zadania pytania, bo już się zgłaszali. Bardzo proszę. Ale zgłaszał się pan do wypowiedzi.
Nie, chciałem tylko powiedzieć tyle, że po pierwsze to jest szaleństwo woke and cancel culture, które dotyczy wielu obszarów, gdzie się usiłuje oceniać zjawiska sprzed dziesięcioleci, stuleci, używając dzisiejszych norm. To jest zwariowane, to jedna sprawa. A druga sprawa, ataki na Jana Pawła II, to jest przede wszystkim polska specyfika i też trzeba o tym wiedzieć. Ja wielokrotnie jeżdżąc za granicę słyszałem, Polacy, co wy robicie? To jest niestety motywowane różnymi względami, o tym trochę było mowy.
Dziękuję bardzo. Jest jeszcze jeden głos.
Bardzo krótko, maybe I will talk in English. I remember what Cardinal Amato said at our conference at University of St. Thomas of Aquinas, Angelicum. It was about St. John Paul II, and he said, there was never such a strong saint like St. John Paul II. And who knew better than Amato? Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czy jest jeszcze? Tak, tam jest jeszcze pani, która się zgłasza.
Mam takie pytanie a propos, bo nie wiem, może to takie śmieszne pytanie w kontekście papieża, ale żeby ogarnąć te wszystkie tematy i te jakby różne zakresy, to chciałam po prostu zapytać o modlitwę Jana Pawła, bo jakby wiele było tutaj, trochę w kilku momentach było to wspomniane, ale no właśnie, chciałam zapytać i też o jego zaufanie do Maryi, bo też tak wprost chciałam o to zapytać.
Nie wiem, czy ktoś z prelegentów chciałby się odnieść do tego pytania, które jest trochę poza tematem, ale nie zupełnie. Zresztą chyba dzisiaj o pobożności maryjnej mówił pan ambasador w odniesieniu chociażby w kontekście narodu węgierskiego. Ale jeżeli jest taka potrzeba, któryś z panów chciałby dodać dwa słowa do tego kontekstu, być może najważniejszego, to znaczy papież jako człowiek modlitwy, to bardzo chętnie, prosimy. Pan profesor Buttiglione.
I can tell a story. One day I was, the Holy Father used it to gather intellectuals, sociologists, theologians, economists, philosophers, to discuss issues that were important for the church. As a rule, when he was preparing an encyclical, he would call a small symposium of experts. And one day he did, and he used to do this in Castel Gandolfo. And I participated in one of them. And as a true philosopher, which I am, immediately after Mass, I went lost. And I did not know how I could reach the conference room. And I entered into a room that was there. It was a kind of warehouse in which there were cleansing materials, and in the center there was the Pope, kneeling and praying. I tried to make myself as small as possible in order not to be perceived. I closed the door, and I still ask myself, which kind of a man is this one, who, when he has 5 free minutes, he kneels down with the rosary and prays. This I have seen, and I can say.
Dziękuję bardzo za to świadectwo. Jest jeszcze jedno pytanie, dopowiedzenie.
Odnośnie tego informacji papieża, do informowania, jaką rolę też odgrywają sekretarze papiescy w informowaniu papieży, czy blokowaniu informacji, że niektóre osoby właśnie potrzebują ominąć przeszkodę sekretarza, żeby poinformować papieża o pewnych sprawach.
Zależy wszystko od tego, kto z panów ma sekretarza. To wtedy mógłby więcej wiedzieć o roli sekretarza.
Well, I'm not so much qualified about speaking about the secretary of John Paul II, but there is one thing I know, that it mostly depends on how much weight you give to the secretary. I mean, as Professor Buttiglione explained, there was Navarro Valls, that was a good friend of the Pope. There were other friends that, you know, used to bypass the secretary and give the information, but bypass in that case perhaps is not the right word. Mostly, you know, John Paul II used to collect information, and that's one thing. In other cases, secretaries can filter information more, but it mostly depends on the Pope, how much the Pope relies on the secretary, how much the Pope wants to listen to the people, I guess.
I know that Jewish has been attacked in Poland and out of Poland. I must give a witness. Stanisław Dziwisz is a man of God, a true friend of John Paul II. He may have made mistakes like me, like everybody, but he was one fundamental element of the system of friends that helped John Paul II. And you must also make a distinction. In the last years, yes, in the last years, you could go to visit John Paul II. It might happen that he could not speak. And then Dziwisz would answer in his, to your questions, and John Paul II would do like this with his head. But when Dziwisz said something he was not in agreement with, he would stop, and with enormous fatigue, he would speak and say his opinion. In the last year, yes, Dziwisz was a kind of filter. It was not possible in any other way. In any other way. Before, no. Before, he organized the information around the Holy Father, yes. And he is, well, I am proud of saying I am a friend of Stanisław Dziwisz.
Czy pan profesor George Weigel chciałby jeszcze jakieś ostatnie zdanie konkluzyjne?
Thank you, Father. Domine non sum dignus. It's been wonderful to be with you all and to think about these matters together. They provide a template for thinking about all of our responsibilities in the church and in the world. I think there remains so much to be learned from John Paul II. But I would say to all of my Polish friends what I said to Cardinal Nitsch and his auxiliary bishops 5 years ago. And that is that it is time for Poland to stop looking back over its shoulder at John Paul II and start looking forward through his eyes. This is not a time for nostalgia. There are many grave questions confronting the Western world today. John Paul II gave us a framework for thinking about many of those, but we can't look through his eyes unless we learn his teaching. And that is a task that remains to be done in many parts of the world church. But I think it remains to be done in Poland as well, and I hope this conference helps advance that learning process. Very grateful for your letting me participate in this from a distance, and let's all pray for each other.
Bardzo dziękuję. Bardzo dziękuję. Proszę Państwa, ta dzisiejsza konferencja pokazywała Jana Pawła II w kontekście świata, w kontekście geopolityki, w kontekście wielkich wydarzeń. Mam nadzieję, że ten ostatni panel, ta ostatnia dyskusja pokazała także Państwu trochę takiej kuchni władzy, tego zaplecza władzy, tego ludzkiego elementu także Jana Pawła II, jego świętości, żebyśmy o tym nie zapomnieli. A Państwa i moimi gośćmi byli, teraz będę jednak patrzył z kartką, żeby nie zapomnieć imion i nazwisk, en direct z Wiecznego Miasta był pan profesor George Weigel, wiadomo. Po mojej prawej stronie pan profesor Rocco Buttiglione, po mojej lewej stronie jego ekscelencja ambasador Erzprinz Eduard Habsburg-Lothringen. No tak się domyśliłem w pewnym momencie. I pan wybaczy, tylko pan w tym kontekście brzmi to trochę właśnie ubogo. Andrea Gagliarducci, ale nazwisko wystarcza za wszystko. Bardzo dziękuję państwu, a teraz chyba dyrektor, który zakończy.
Szanowni Państwo, ja tak bardzo krótko, niestety przepraszam, też dzisiaj moje samopoczucie jest na tyle słabe, że część tych paneli po prostu obserwowałem online, bo nie jestem w stanie na żywo i już bez kartki, bo rano miałem przygotowane przemówienie. Powiem tak, że jestem wzruszony i dziękuję wszystkim prelegentom, wszystkim, którzy zabierali dzisiaj głos. To były ważne, to były mocne słowa i to były słowa, które są, myślę, dla nas do przepracowania. To nie jest tak, że to, co dzisiaj usłyszeliśmy raz, ja będę sobie słuchał tego i zastanawiał się nad tymi zdaniami, które tutaj padały wielokrotnie. I myślę, że dla nas, dla pracowników muzeum, dla tych wszystkich, którzy będą tutaj przychodzili i będą mogli usłyszeć to, co szanowni państwo nam przekazali, bo my będziemy się dzielili tą wiedzą, bo nie jesteśmy samolubni, chcemy się dzielić tą wiedzą. To było wydarzenie niesamowite. Jeszcze raz z całego serca dziękuję wszystkim panelistom i wszystkim, oczywiście panu ambasadorowi Kotańskiemu jeszcze raz podkreślę, bo to w dużej mierze jego pomysł, jego sugestia, jego też siła napędu, ale bez pracowników Muzeum Mt 514, bez pani profesor Gardzińskiej, bez Justyny, która tam siedzi skromnie na końcu, ale bez wszystkich pracowników, w moim stopniu najmniejszym tak naprawdę, bo tak to zawsze jest, ta konferencja by się nie odbyła. Więc ja naprawdę serdecznie dziękuję i najpiękniej jak mogę. Nie jestem w stanie wyrazić słowami też wzruszenia. Dziękuję pięknie i kłaniam się państwu nisko. Dobrego wieczoru życzę.